Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to be having a little build and review of the Academy 1/72nd scale Curtis P-40 M/N variant. So I'm doing this kit up for a little stop motion project I have planned around the Battle of Milne Bay. Technically the P-40s that were operating at Milne Bay during the battle in August of 1942 were the earlier E variant, and this kit is the M and N. However, the differences are pretty subtle, and I'll talk about them a little bit while we make this model. But that's enough from me. Let's get into it. Upon opening the box, you'll receive around about 5 different sheets of paper, the decals, including some special Australian markings, and 3 sets of sprues moulded in grey plastic and a set of clear ones. So the first thing I do is give the sprues a clean in some warm soapy water, and then I start to cut out the parts and assemble the cockpit. I use a set of side cutters mainly to remove the parts, and then I use Revell Contactor Professional to glue them into place. The cockpit for the P-40 by Academy has some pretty nice details, including a seat, the rudder pedals, joystick, and also the hydraulic pump on the right side of the joystick. So some nice details overall, and assembling them was pretty easy. The main instrument panel does not come with a decal, so you have to hand paint all of the raised detail. I cut part of the frame out so I can use it as a handle to hold the instrument panel and give it a coat of XF1 flat black. After that, I then cut out the fuselage halves and do a little bit of cleanup of the excess sprue using the side cutters and some sanding. I paint the inside walls of the cockpit and the floor Tamiya XF71 cockpit green. I do about 2 coats and make sure the paint is slightly thinned with a little bit of water so it flows into the gaps and helps show the detail when the final paint has dried. The insides of the oil radiator system were painted Tamiya XF62 olive drab based on reference photos. Although there was no decals included for the instrument panel, there was some raised detail, so I used a very fine brush to apply some dry XF2 flat white. I first dab the brush on a bit of paper towel so that the paint I'm left with is dry and will not flow, and then I gently sort of dab it over the top of the instrument details, and eventually the paint will stick to just the raised details, making it look like there's instruments there. After I dry brushed the instrument details, I added a few extra little switches and dots just using the fine brush with a bit of white and also some Vallejo vermilion red. After a third and final layer of cockpit green over the entire interior, I then painted some of the sidewall details using a bit of XF1 flat black and also a bit of XF16 flat aluminium. I also used the flat aluminium to create some chipping by getting a brush and wiping it on some paper towel so that the paint becomes dry, and then dabbing it into the areas that are likely to receive a bit of chipping and weathering, such as the areas where the pilot's feet are and on the ribs of the sidewall detail. Afterwards, I neaten that up with a little bit of cockpit green, and then I paint the final details, such as a little bit of red-brown on the control column's leather jacket, and a little bit of vermilion red on some of the switches. A final coat of flat aluminium is applied to the seat before I get some 1mm Tamiya masking tape and cut it to shape to create some seat belts. After the seat belts were put into their position, I then used a fine brush to paint them XF52 flat earth to make them just a little bit darker. The included instrument panel, when you look at reference photos, is a little bit too rounded on the corners, so I used a set of sprue cutters to cut down the sides to make it a little bit more flat and square-like, before gluing it and the radiator in place, and then gluing the 2 fuselage halves together. The instrument panel was a bit tricky to get to fit correctly, but after a bit of sanding it was alright. The fuselage halves, however, were both very good at fitting together, and there was almost no gap whatsoever. The cockpit can then get pushed up into the fuselage from where the wings would be and then glued into position. The fit for the cockpit was really good. The kit comes with the option to build the P-40 either with the side windows or a later version which had the rear section of the cockpit cut down and an extra piece of plexiglass put in for added rear visibility. I chose to do the side window variant because this was more accurate for the P-40s that were stationed at Milne Bay during the battle. Technically these P-40s were the E variant, but the only major external differences between the two are the exhausts and also an extra air intake forward of the exhausts on the right side of the engine cowling. I cut out the 2 wing sections and sanded the excess sprue away using a file and then some sandpaper, and then I glued the 2 wing halves together and held them in place with some bulldog clips while the 2 halves dried together. I glued the propeller into place very carefully so that it would spin. It's relatively easy to do. There's a small little washer that goes on the end of a small tip that's attached to the cowling. You just have to take care not to glue the wash to anything except for the cowling. I then put a little bit of glue on the sides of the base of the propeller hub and then put the propeller spinner on. I then glued the finer accessories such as the tail wheel and the two flaps for the door that covers them, and then I removed the elevators from the sprue and cleaned away some of the flash and the excess sprue with a file. The elevators both have different tabs that are designed to join into the fuselage, but only on one particular side, which means you can't mix them up. I then glued the wings into position, putting a little bit of Revell Contactor Professional on the base and then pushing them into position. The fit was nice and tight and there wasn't really too much of a gap to speak of. I then glued the landing gear into position. The detail on the landing gear struts was really quite good, and they also fitted quite solidly to the wings. The landing gear bay doors were a little bit fiddly, but with the help of some tweezers I managed to glue them into position. I then cut the wheels out of their sprue, and then I used a file to sand down one of the edges to make them a little bit flatter so that they looked like they had a bit of weight on them. Overall, the details on the wheels was very nice, especially the tyre tread pattern and also the wheel hubs cover. Finally, I glued the last few details, including the cow flaps and also the exhausts, onto the model, and then it was time to prepare the aircraft for some painting. Overall, the fit of this kit was really quite excellent. The only larger gap that was present was where the wing root joins to the fuselage, so I got out a cocktail stick and a little bit of Vallejo water-based putty and used the cocktail stick to apply the putty along the edge where the seam was. I also applied a little bit of putty where the fuselage halves meet, especially on the underside and where the air intake is for the radiators. I then removed some of the excess putty with my finger, and after letting the putty dry for 24 hours, I then get some fine sandpaper and sand back the seam line where the fuselage halves meet and also the excess putty. I use a small needle to remove the extra putty out of the sunken panel lines that I don't want the putty to obviously be in, and then after that I use a small brush to dust away any extra debris, and finally it's time for a little bit of painting. I started off painting the model with the lightest colour first, which is Tamiya XF83 Medium C Grade 2 RAF. When hand painting your models, it's best to make sure that you apply the paint in nice thin coats using a relatively large brush, and also trying to apply the paint on in the same direction to reduce visible brush strokes. The acrylics I use are by Tamiya, which means that they can be thinned with either a special Tamiya lacquer or also just water. I use just water to thin my paints down and I have satisfactory results. The second coat of paint I apply is the second lightest colour, which is XF52 Flat Earth. It's basically the lighter colour on the upper side, so I apply it over the entire upper surface of the model. I take care to try and carefully paint it around the areas where there is a little bit of medium grey, however you can always come along later and fix up any mistakes you make. Ideally when hand painting you want your layers to be nice and thin. As you can see, after only one coat of paint you can still kind of see the colour of the plastic underneath, which is perfectly alright because as you build up layers they will become more and more uniform. I apply a second coat of XF83 on the entire underside of the model, and then I apply another coat of XF52 Flat Earth on the upper side of the model. By the second layer of paint you can't really see any of the plastic base colour showing through. At this stage I also apply the third and final colour in this camouflage scheme, which is Tamiya XF81 Dark Green 2 RAF. As you can see, I don't really mask my camouflages when I'm painting them. I simply use a relatively large brush to apply the pattern, and then I'll carefully fill in the shape if it's a larger surface, such as on the wings. In smaller sections, such as along the edges of the radiator and where the cockpit is, it's relatively easy to just apply a thin strip using the brush. After I've applied the entire of the camouflage pattern, I then go over the XF83 with a second coat, taking care not to overpaint the areas that I've previously done, and where the XF52 Flat Earth and 83 Medium Sea Grey is. Both the Medium Sea Grey and Flat Earth receive a third coat of paint. At this final stage I also take the chance to neaten up any of the mistakes I've made, and also to make sure the shapes are correct for the camouflage pattern. Once this is done, it's then time to paint some of the finer details. I carefully paint the rear section of the cockpit that previously hadn't been painted with some XF71 cockpit green, and then I get a fine brush and apply the same colour on the frames of the canopy. With the transparent parts you can paint the exterior, which has the raised details, very carefully with the interior colour, and then later on apply the exterior colour on the outside so that it doesn't show through. I then paint the interior of the landing gear bay doors for both the main wheels and the tail wheel with the cockpit green, and then I use a bit of XF1 flat black to paint the tyres. I also use a bit of flat black for the glare shield for the instrument panel, the propellers, and also to paint some of the details for the gun sight. I painted the headrest for the Pilot XF64 red brown, and then I used a bit of XF16 flat aluminium to paint the landing gear struts and also the machine gun barrels. For my exhausts, I paint them initially X31 titanium gold, and later on I'll do a little bit of weathering to make them look a little bit more rusty. Finally, a little bit of flat yellow was painted onto the tips of the propeller blades, and then I use a cocktail stick to scratch any excess cockpit green off of areas I don't want it on the transparent parts. One of the advantages of the water-based acrylics via Tamiya is that you can scratch them off relatively easily using a sharp object. Just take care not to apply too much pressure, otherwise you might start to scratch the plastic. I glued the machine gun sight into position, and then I apply a little bit of panel liner on the interior parts of the cockpit before it's time to apply some decals. With the Academy kit, you're spoilt for choice. There are 3 options in the box, and if you're in Australia, this model kit also comes with an extra set of Australian markings. The markings included are for either the US Air Force based in China, a scheme for an Australian P-40 based in New Guinea in 1945, and also a North African Royal Air Force scheme, with the famous shark's teeth. I was doing one of the P-40s from Milne Bay, and I chose to do A29-133, nicknamed Polly, which is currently on display still at the Australian War Memorial. I did encounter a little bit of confusion with the roundels on the aircraft. It appears that in July 1942 the order was given to paint over the red on the wing roundels because a lot of Allied aircraft were getting mistaken for Japanese aircraft due to the red dot present on the old Royal Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force roundel. However, they were retained on the fuselage side until sometime later in 1942 or early 1943. As a result, most of the P-40s at Milne Bay would have had the red dot still on the sides of the aircraft fuselage, but not on the wings. I decided, however, to just go with as the aircraft is restored at the Australian War Memorial, but later on, after finding some extra sources and after making this video, I ended up painting the red dot onto the roundel. Initially, I used the Royal Australian Air Force markings for the wings, and I used the Royal Air Force roundels for the fuselage sides and painted over the red dot to create a little bit of a more weathered effect, as you'll see later. To apply the decals, I use my normal technique of dipping the sheet in water after cutting out the decals I want, and then after the decals have come loose, carefully sliding them off the transfer paper using a brush, and then using my finger to maneuver them into position, adding a little bit of water if they start to get a little bit stuck down and I'm still positioning them. After I've applied all the decals, I then put a little bit of Vallejo decal softener over the top of them using a cotton tip, carefully rolling them so as not to tear the decals, and then I apply a little bit of Tamiya decal adhesive over the top of them. The decal adhesive helps the decals obviously adhere to the model so they stick down better, and the Vallejo decal softener makes them a little bit better at folding and bending to show the panel lines and surface detail underneath. Overall, the quality of decals on this kit were really quite good, maybe a tiny bit thick for the Academy ones, and the decals included for the extra Australian Air Force scheme were a little bit prone to tearing, but overall pretty good, and they responded nicely to both the Vallejo decal softener and the Tamiya decal adhesive. As I mentioned, I created a little bit more of a weathered effect by painting over the red on the side fuselage roundels with a little bit of white. I also used the same fine brush and the white to paint some of the markings that were not included in the kit, including the S on the tail and also the inscription Polly on the engine cowling. I find that the key to painting finer details is to try and use the tip of the brush, and also to have your hand resting on a surface to avoid any shakes and wobbles that might cause any mess or imperfections. After painting on the finer markings, I then glue the canopy side windows and the front windshield in place using just a tiny bit of Revell Contactor Professional and taking care not to get it on the glass. I then paint a coat of RAF green over the windshield using a fine brush, and then scratch away the excess using the cocktail stick, and just like that, the canopy is finished. Moving on to the weathering process, I begin by using my usual technique of a brush and some XF16 flat aluminium and dabbing it onto the surfaces of the model to create some metal chipping. I focus on the leading edges of the wings, the walkway area where the pilot and ground crew would walk to get up to the cockpit, the leading edge of the elevators, around the landing gear, the leading edge of the tail, and also around the edges of any hatches and access panels, the sides of the canopy and the area where the canopy slides, and also on the edges of the control surfaces. I then got out the Tamiya panel liner scent and applied it onto the areas where the recessed panel lines existed for the control surfaces, and also around some of the various access hatches and the filler caps for the oil and the fuel, around some of the panel lines, and especially under the radiator. I also streaked a little bit backwards coming out from where the radiator would be, and later on I'd use a little bit of enamel thinner to thin out the effects. The panel liners for kind of two reasons. The first is a little bit of weathering to create some of the streaks and oily grinds that you'll see on a lot of aircraft, and also to create a little bit of a post-shading effect, especially for highlighting the control surfaces. Once the Tamiya panel liner has dried, I'll then get out some Tamiya enamel thinners and a relatively fine brush and apply it onto the areas where I want to remove some of the excess panel liner. Notice when I want to remove the excess panel liner, I'll keep rubbing the area where I want it gone using the enamel thinner on the brush, and on the areas where I want to create streaks, I'll instead drag the brush backwards in the direction of the airflow, which as it thins down the panel liners will also streak it backwards, creating the kind of streaking effect I'm looking for. One of the advantages of previously doing the camouflage with acrylics is that they won't interact with the enamel thinners. However, the panel liner, since it's enamel based, will, which means you'll be able to thin out the weathering effects from the panel liners, but you won't remove the camouflage colour from underneath. Once I'm satisfied with the effects I've created using the panel wash, I then move on to using some of the Tamiya weathering powders. I use a little bit of black weathering powder to create the exhaust smokes and stains coming back from the exhausts, and then I use a little bit of rust to create some rust effects on the exhausts and also on the underside. I use it to create some of the coolant leaks coming from the radiator by applying it using a brush and streaking it backwards in the direction of the airflow, and then removing it with the paper towel and then repeating the process until I'm satisfied with the final result. I also repeat this process behind the wheel well to create some mud effects, since the airbase at Milne Bay was very muddy. I use a very fine brush to add a little bit of black to create some extra gun smoke coming from out of the machine gun barrels where the wings are, and also to add a little bit of extra black coming out of the radiator, and then finally I add a little bit more rust and also some other shades of brown to both the tyres, and also a little bit of extra brown coming out from where the landing gear is, and with that the model is finally completed. And here you can see the final result, both before and after I added the red back onto the roundel on the fuselage. I also have a few photos that I used as reference of both the real poly at the Australian War Memorial and also some reference videos of Royal Australian Air Force Kittyhawks in action. So after building this kit, I have to say that it fits together really exceptionally well. The details are a little bit simplified in some areas, however for the most part they're still pretty decent, especially when you consider this is a 1999 tooling, it's still pretty up there. The cost for it is not too much either, $20 is pretty reasonable, and it's nice that they include a wide range of decal schemes, including the extra Australian scheme if you're buying this kit in Australia. So overall, I think it's really wonderful Academy have done such a good job rendering this kit back in 1999, and it's excellent that it's still on the market today. I think the P-40 is sadly one of the most underappreciated aircraft of World War II, which I think's, like I said, pretty sad because it's really a tough, versatile aircraft. I think it looks really cool with the massive oil radiators in the front there, and it was used in every theatre during World War II, and very vital to both the Russians, the Americans, the British, but also us, the Australians. Without the P-40s at Milne Bay, it's very likely that the Japanese would have managed to get a foothold in Australia, so we were very lucky to have them at the time to basically do what the Spitfire did for Britain. So it's a bit of a shame the P-40 isn't as recognised as it should be, I reckon. But you can grab one of these kits and have a go at it. It's a really wonderful airplane, and it's an easy kit for both beginners and also advanced builders. It's not too expensive, details are good, and you have a nice choice of decals. Thanks very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also leave a little comment in the comment section down below. And I'll also leave a link in the description to Techtonichobbies website where you can buy this kit and many others. Now, as I mentioned, I'll be doing a future series of videos on some other projects around this Milne Bay film that I'm looking at doing in hopefully the later part of December. So stay tuned for updates on that. You can also check out my Patreon page. That's it for now, and until the next video, model on.